In this video, I want to demonstrate how to add checkpoint functionality to a vertical scroller style game. In addition to adding checkpoints, there's also going to be functionality where you can only move once you have destroyed enemies or accomplished some sort of objective. So in this style of game, a checkpoint can be thought of as a lot of different things. So obviously we want to respect the player's progress and what they've accomplished in the game, but then we also want to force the player to have to destroy things, have to collect things, whatever the goal or objective is, they have to be able to do it instead of just going right past it. So let me show you what we're working on. Real basic game. Of course, whenever I model something out, it's just a bunch of blocks and squares. You'll notice that once I get close to this enemy, if I haven't taken him out, this little scroller in the middle that pulls me and propels me forward in the game just stops. So in the upper right hand corner, this is the Y coordinate of this particular spaceship. So in my games, when I'm trying to figure things out, I like to put some debugging on the screen. It kind of helps me figure out whether my code's working. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to take this guy out. All right, once I take him out, this recalculates to figure out what's the next nearest enemy's Y coordinate. This yellow line right here is my checkpoint. I have achieved my checkpoint. So now, if for some reason one of these guys takes me out, I should be able to start over with my progress respected. But once again, once I get close to these guys, the scroller stops and I better accomplish this mission. I better get rid of these enemies to earn the right to go forward. And then I'm constantly recalculating what is my next closest enemy. So obviously I have a bunch of stuff in here. You would make that invisible. As the game goes on, obviously it should progress in difficulty, and here I am. I got to take these guys out. Once I do, I should be able to earn the next checkpoint. And 523 is the Y coordinate of my next nearest enemy. And now it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So that's what we're making. To accomplish this, I've got a lot of different tasks. In my project right now, as you can see, I have some enemies. I have my player. The player is actually drug across the screen by a scroller. The scroller has a bullet, and then there's different code in here that makes sure that the player can only, or the spaceship, whatever you end up making your player, can only wander off from the scroller so much. So the scroller is constantly moving up the screen, and we're making sure that the player doesn't lag too far behind. So I don't really need any of these event groups. I just like to stay organized. For the purposes of this demonstration, we need an event group called checkpoint. And this is going to be for the events and actions that define checkpoint functionality. The other thing I like to have in my games is like a debug sort of text box. And in my game, I have a heads-up display, a HUD layer that has parallax 00. And you will see that my debug guy is in the top right-hand corner. Whenever you're trying to code something and it has variables and values, put one of those in there, and then you can use it to debug your game, and you can just take it out later. It's not a huge deal. Okay, so the crux of the game is that I need to figure out what is the nearest enemy. And I need to know what its Y coordinate is. In other words, where is it vertically? So we're going to do some calculations, but I'm going to need a variable. And I'm going to call this variable exactly what it's going to store, which is nearest enemy Y. And what this is this is going to be the Y coordinate of the nearest enemy. Once I have that, I'll be able to compare it to my spaceship, my scroller, and all that good stuff. I'm going to put it into the event group, which makes it a local variable. And then I'm going to add a system event, and I'm going to pick all of my enemy object instances. All right, and drag that in there. What we're going to do is we are going to take a look at each one of the enemy's Y coordinate, and we're going to see which one has the highest Y coordinate. Because in a vertical style game, if I start at the bottom, then the one closest to me has the highest Y coordinate. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sub-event. And in this sub-event, I'm just going to compare two values. I'm going to compare the value of enemy's Y coordinate, and I'm going to see whether it is greater than or equal to the value of my variable, my nearest enemy Y. So what we're going to do is we're looping through all of the enemies, and we're comparing their Y values, where they're at on the screen vertically, And if we find one that's greater than what's currently in nearest enemy Y, we're just going to set the value of nearest enemy Y to that enemy's Y coordinate. So this is typical algorithm for like looping through something and finding the minimum or maximum. And just for giggles, while I'm testing to make sure that everything's working, I'm going to use that debug text box that I have on the HUD layer to see the value of this variable. I want to see whether this is working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the game. 2743. So that is this guy's Y coordinate. He's way up the layout. So if I get rid of him, my code should recalculate the next greatest Y coordinate of any enemy. And there it is. It took me out. If we were to start the game all over again, this guy here, still 2743. So that looks like that's working just great. Now it's time to compare our nearest enemy Y to the Y position of the player. What we don't want to happen, we do not want the player to be able to go past enemies. We want to stop the scroller. We want to disable its bullet behavior so that the player is forced to battle the enemy. So in order to do that, we're going to go in here, we're going to add a sub event. And the sub event that we're going to add is once again going to compare two values. What we're going to do, we're going to compare the player Y's value to the nearest enemy. So we're going to say, let's say less than or equal to, and then nearest enemy. Now the issue I'm going to have is that the player needs to be further down the layout. So what I'm going to do when I do my comparison is I'm going to subtract a certain number of pixels. These pixels represent the amount of space that I want to keep between the enemies and the player. So what I do is I take the player's Y coordinate, I subtract 524 from it, which would push it up the screen, and then I compare it to nearest enemy Y. So really what this is doing is figuring out, is the player within 520 pixels of the closest enemy? And if that is the case, then we're going to go to our scroller, we're going to find that bullet behavior, and we're going to disable it. Now, if for some reason the player is beyond 520 pixels from the nearest enemy, we're going to have an else condition. So add else, and in this particular case, scroller is going to be re-enabled. Let's see if this works. So once again, we pick all the enemies, we figure out what's the nearest one that has the greatest Y coordinate. Now we're comparing the player's Y coordinate, as far as how high or low it is on the layout, to the nearest enemy Y. If it gets 520 pixels or closer, then we are going to disable the scroller, which is going to force them to battle the enemy. Otherwise, we'll re-enable the scroller. So let's play it. So here I am. Still got my 2743 up there. Here I am. I get really close, and it freezes me. And it forces me to fight the enemy. So I'm going to come in again. This time I'm going to take it out. Obviously, I'm still traveling. Pretty soon, I'm going to see my next batch of enemies. Here we are. And if I get within 520 pixels, it freezes me. It forces me to fight off these guys. And then I can keep going. So that functionality is working great. Our next step is to add our checkpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably put those on the game layer. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to create a new object type. It's going to be an invisible sprite, but I'm going to give it some color so we can see it while we're testing. And I'll just call it checkpoint with capital C. And you can see it's going to go on the game layer just fine. I'm going to resize mine. It's going to be 640 pixels wide because that's the length of my layout. And for now, I'll make it 10 pixels tall so we can deal with it. I'll give it some color for now, and we'll go from there. Excellent. So if we zoom in, we'll see I have these checkpoints. My checkpoint is going to need an instance variable because each checkpoint needs to have its own ID so that I'll be able to place the player at this checkpoint. So we're going to create an instance variable, call it checkpoint. And this is going to be checkpoint that what player has earned. Okay. Now it's really up to us to put these on our layout where we want them. So I'm going to give this guy checkpoint 1. I'm going to select him. I'm going to align to the layout, center horizontally. And then really all I have to do, I can move things around a little bit, move things down. I can control, drag, release to create some other ones right there. We'll make this one checkpoint number 2. And we will align it so it looks great. Come up the layout, control, drag, release. Select the darn thing. Once again, I'm going to align it. Just got to get my hands on it. There we go. And this one's going to be checkpoint number 3. Excellent. Okay. We have our checkpoints in place. Looks something like that. Looking good. Now we need to create an event for the collision with the checkpoint. So we're going to add an event whenever the player collides with the checkpoint. We're going to do something. What we need to be able to do, we need to be able to store the checkpoint that they've earned. That's going to be a global variable. So let's go ahead and create a global variable. Let's call it checkpoint. By default, it'll be 0 because the player has not earned a checkpoint. And this will be checkpoint player has earned. Okay, so anytime the player collides with the checkpoint, what we have to do is we have to set the value of that checkpoint variable to whatever the instance variable value is for the checkpoint they collided with. Okay, so what's going to happen is if I collide with this guy, the checkpoint global variable needs to be set to this guy's value. In this case, we set it to 2. In this case, we set it to 3. So that's what's happening here. Whenever the player collides with a checkpoint object, an invisible sprite, we will set the global variable checkpoint to whatever that checkpoint's checkpoint instance variable is. That way we can keep track of how much progress the player has earned and we can respect it. So speaking of respecting it, at the start of the layout, if for some reason the player's taken out and they've earned a checkpoint, I want to position them to wherever that checkpoint is, respects their progress. So we're going to go in here and we are going to, on start of layout, add a sub event. And so our sub event is going to have a couple different conditions to it. First thing, we need to compare two values. We want to make sure that only when the checkpoint global variable is greater than 0 do we consider positioning the player. Then what we can do is we can add another condition which is going to filter. We are going to choose the checkpoint object instance on the screen whose checkpoint value equals the global variable. So if someone earned checkpoint 1, all we're doing is we're going out and we're picking the invisible sprite that has a checkpoint value of 1, for example. And then really all we have to do is we're going to position our scroller to that checkpoint object. So we can do set position, and whatever checkpoint object was picked in our condition, that's where we're going to place our player, or sorry, the scroller, which will in turn position our player. So on start of layout, if we're not just beginning the game and the player hasn't, earned any checkpoints yet, then we are going to pick out from the layout the checkpoint that equals the checkpoint they have earned. So if they earned, the second checkpoint, then we're going to pick that checkpoint object and we're going to position the scroller to the one that we picked. So let's play that real quick. So if I take this guy out and I achieve my checkpoint, boom. and then these guys take me out, then I should restart, my scroller should restart here, which it does. The problem is that there's an enemy there. So now I need the code that destroys any of the enemies that are below that checkpoint. And that ends up being actually pretty easy to do. We are going to add another sub-event to the onStart of layout. And we're going to find any of the enemies whose Y value is greater than or equal to the checkpoint object that the player has earned. If we find any enemies whose Y value is greater than the checkpoint's Y value, meaning that it's further down the screen, then we got to destroy those enemies. So go into enemy and simply destroy those. And let's play it. So here we are. If I take this guy out real quick and I earn this checkpoint, then when the next batch of people get me, which I would gladly let them do, I should restart at that checkpoint. And the enemies below me should be gone. As you can see, those enemies are gone. These enemies are still here. I'm going to go ahead and take these dudes out. And that's going to push me up the layout. I want to earn my next checkpoint. Here we are. Here come these guys. I'm going to let them take me out. Boom. I should have the second checkpoint earned. And that's where I'll start. And I should see these batch of 3 up here. Okay, that should do it. All you really have to do is hide any of those objects that you were using to debug things. And you should have a pretty robust progress and checkpoint functionality that you can add to a vertical style game.